Crimson Mask of Lancaster Square, Inspector Purbright, BBC radio drama. The afternoon of Founders' Day in Flaxborough had arranged itself with the dutiful obedience of a well-trained domestic. A high watercolour sky of palest blue, a sun that provided warmth without impertinent glare, and a breeze just firm enough to lend a patriotic flutter to the Union flag above the town hall. It was, as Mayor Augustus Nettleship was fond of saying, a day for which the town could be justly proud. He was saying so now at considerable length, from a bunting-draped dais erected in the centre of Lancaster Square. Inspector Purbright of the Borough Police, standing discreetly near the War Memorial, felt that the mayor's pride was perhaps a trifle over-leveraged. The crowd, a respectable assembly of shoppers, schoolchildren marshalled into unwilling silence, and councillors in their Sunday best, listened with an air of stoic endurance. They had heard it all before. They would, with a bit of luck, live to hear it all again next year. The mayor's speech was as much a part of the town's civic calendar as the blockage of the drains in November. A testament, boomed Mayor Nettleship, his voice richly marbled with self-congratulation, to the steadfast, unwavering, and unimpeachable spirit of our forebears. He gestured with a proprietary sweep of his hand towards a small, velvet-draped table to his left. Upon it, resting on a cushion of faded purple, sat the Crimson Mask of Lancaster. To the uninitiated eye, the mask was a disappointment. It was a simple domino mask of worn velvet, the colour of dried blood rather than fresh crimson. Its historical significance, however, was immense, or at least that was the story agreed upon by the town council. It was said to have been worn by Sir Jasper Pounceby, the town's somewhat dubious founder, during a celebratory masque in 1788. Mr. Alastair Finch, the local historian and a man whose entire posture was an apology for existing, guarded its reputation with the ferocity of a mother badger. He hovered near the table now, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression one of profound anxiety, as if the very air of the 21st century might cause the relic to disintegrate. Protecting the mask from such atmospheric threats was a heavy glass case, polished to a state of near invisibility. It was a new acquisition, approved by the council after a fractious debate regarding cost, and its presence was, to the mayor, the centrepiece of the day's triumph. "Secure," the mayor continued, tapping a stout finger on his speech notes, "for generations to come. A beacon of our heritage protected by the very best of modern. The mayor's search for the right word was interrupted by the borough's electrical supply, which, having a theatrical sense of timing, chose that exact moment to fail. The microphone gave a startled squawk and fell silent. The clock tower lights went out. The festoon lamps strung between the lampposts blinked off. For a full 3 seconds, Lancaster Square was plunged into a sudden and surprisingly complete darkness, the sort that silences a crowd not with fear, but with a unified, communal groan of weary expectation. "Oh, for goodness sake!" came a sharp, female voice from the front row, which Purbright recognized as belonging to Mrs. Millicent Trimble of the Ladies' Guild. There was a shuffling, a few nervous titters, and then, with a hesitant flicker, the lights returned. The clock tower bonged 3 o'clock, as if recovering its composure. The crowd blinked, adjusting their eyes. Mayor Nettleship, his face frozen in an expression of thwarted eloquence, prepared to resume his oration. But he never got the chance. A sound cut through the murmuring. It was not a scream of terror nor a shout of alarm. It was a thin, strangled gasp of pure professional horror. All heads turned towards the dais. Mr. Alastair Finch was standing rigid, his face the colour of putty. One trembling finger was extended, pointing at the velvet-draped table. The glass case was still there, gleaming under the restored light. The purple cushion was still there, looking rather forlorn, but it was empty. The Crimson Mask of Lancaster was gone. For a moment, nobody moved. The concept was too absurd, too untidy to be immediately grasped. It was like finding a cow in the public library. One's first instinct was not to call the police, but to question one's own senses. Then the mayor understood. The colour flooded into his face, a deep, arterial crimson that almost made up for the absence of the mask. His grand day, his speech, his moment of civic glory, all had been upstaged by an empty cushion. It was an intolerable breach of etiquette. What is the meaning of this? He bellowed, his voice no longer oratorical, but simply angry. "Finch! What have you done? Me?" squeaked Mr. Finch, finding his voice. It's vanished. It was there. And now." Purbright began to move, calmly and without haste, through the petrified clusters of onlookers. Sergeant Love, a solid and reassuringly unimaginative man, fell into step beside him. "A prank, sir, I expect," Love murmured, his gaze sweeping the square for any sign of a fleeing miscreant. "Some of the grammar school lads?" "Perhaps, Sergeant," Purbright said, his tone one of mild academic interest. He reached the edge of the dais as the mayor was beginning to swell with righteous fury. "Inspector!" Nettleship barked, citing him. "This is an outrage, a disgrace to the borough. I demand you find the culprit immediately." Purbright tipped his hat in a gesture of polite acknowledgement. His eyes, however, were on the empty display case and the historian, who was now gently patting the purple cushion as if to soothe it. "Tell me, Mr. Finch," the inspector asked, his voice quiet enough to cut through the mayor's blustering. "The council specified that new wiring be installed for the pageant, did they not? Did they ever get around to it?" Mr. Finch flinched as if Purbright's question about the wiring were a personal accusation. "I submitted a report, Inspector, in triplicate. I warned the subcommittee on civic amenities that the circuit was prone to episodes. The mayor felt the expenditure was not, at this present time, justifiable." Mayor Nettleship's face darkened. "That is a gross misrepresentation of a confidential council meeting, Finch. The point is not the wiring. The point is the theft. One does seem to have provided the opportunity for the other," Purbright noted mildly, his gaze resting on the empty glass case with an expression of placid contemplation. A most unfortunate coincidence. By the time the police had erected a cordon of rope and stakes around the dais, an act which gave the scene the air of a minor agricultural show, the story of the vanishing mask had already escaped. It travelled faster than an official statement, and with infinitely more embellishment, spreading through the arteries of Flaxborough to its vital organs, the public houses and the tea rooms. At the Silver Spoon, an establishment where the clinking of spoons on saucers could convey degrees of social disapproval, Mrs. Millicent Trimble was holding court. She sat bolt upright, her formidable hat trembling with conviction, a half-eaten scone lying forgotten on her plate. "Mark my words. It's political," she announced to her audience, which consisted of 2 widows and the vicar's wife. "It's these agitators from the university in Chalmsbury. They come here with their pamphlets and their peculiar facial hair, and they have no respect for tradition." "But what would they want with the mask?" asked Mrs. Gable, one of the widows, her brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "It's a symbol, Agnes," Mrs. Trimble explained, with the patient air of one instructing a particularly slow child. "They are attacking the very fabric of our society. Augustus Nettleship may be a pompous fool, we all know that, but he represents order. This is an attack on order. I shouldn't be at all surprised if they burn it in some sort of ritual." This last thought was delivered with such grim satisfaction that it seemed to give her more pleasure than the scone ever could. A different, though no less certain, version of events was being formulated in the public bar of the Chaff's Hotel. Here, the air was thick with the scent of beer and grievance. Mr. Horace Grindle, proprietor of Grindle's Hardware, slammed his empty pint glass onto the bar. "Serves 'em right," he grunted to no one in particular, but loud enough for everyone to hear. Mr. Grindle was a man perpetually at odds with the world, and most particularly with the Flaxborough Town Council, spending ratepayers' money on a glass box for a bit of old tack. "A beacon of heritage," he mimicked, his voice a cruel parody of Mayor Nettleship's boom. While the potholes in Market Street could swallow a small car, "I hope whoever took it sells it for scrap." "You don't think it was valuable then, Horace?" asked the publican, polishing a glass with a dirty rag. "Valuable?" Grindle scoffed. "Only to fools and councillors, and they're often one and the same. It's a protest, that's what it is. A fellow ratepayer making his feelings known." "Can't say I blame him." He squinted into his empty glass. "In fact, I'd buy him a pint if I knew who he was." Back in Lancaster Square, the afternoon was beginning to fade. The crowd had dispersed, leaving only the police, the deeply offended councillors, and the editor of the Flaxborough Chronicle, who was busily taking notes for a front-page story that would refer to a daring daylight raid by a master criminal. Sergeant Love stood beside Purbright, his notebook open at a clean page. It remained stubbornly blank. "Well, sir," Love said, with the sigh of a man confronted with human folly, "we have no witnesses, no signs of forced entry on the case, and a whole town full of opinions. According to Mrs. Trimble, it was anarchists, and according to Horace Grindle, it was a civic hero." "People do so love to fit a crime to their own worldview, Sergeant," Purbright observed, watching as a constable took a photograph of the empty velvet cushion. "It's so much tidier than fitting a worldview to the facts of the crime." He adjusted his hat slightly, a small, thoughtful gesture. "I think perhaps it is time we had a quiet word with the mayor, and then a rather more detailed one with Mr. Finch." The mayor's parlour was a room that took itself very seriously. Dark wood panelling, portraits of previous mayors all wearing expressions of pained dignity, and a large mahogany desk clear of all but a silver inkstand and a leather-bound blotter. It was a room designed for the issuing of proclamations, not for the untidy business of a police investigation. Mayor Nettleship had seated himself behind the desk, transforming the interview into an audience. "The long and short of it, Inspector," he began, steepling his fingers, "is that this is a calculated attack on the civic pride of Flaxborough. It is incumbent upon your office to act with the utmost celerity." Purbright, seated opposite in a chair that seemed designed to encourage humility, nodded slowly. "Celerity is always our aim, Mr. Mayor. To that end, could you tell me who had access to the display case?" The mayor waved a dismissive hand. "Finch, of course. He fusses over that mask like a hen with one chick. Polishing the glass, adjusting the cushion. Frankly, it's an obsession. But the key is kept here, in this very desk in a locked drawer. I unlocked it myself this morning and gave the key to Finch under my direct supervision. He returned it to me no more than an hour before the pageant." "So only you and Mr. Finch handled the key today?" Sergeant Love asked, his pen poised over his notebook, and the town clerk who witnessed the handover. "A matter of protocol," the mayor clarified, as if protocol were a shield against all possible wrongdoing. "The point, man, is not the key. The case wasn't opened." "It was spirited away?" "In the dark. It smacks of professional work. A gang, I shouldn't wonder." "Come from one of the cities, having read about our famous artifact," Purbright considered this. "The Crimson Mask was famous for about a 10-mile radius around Flaxborough, a fame based on repetition rather than any intrinsic merit. The idea of a hardened gang of jewel thieves risking their liberty for it seemed optimistic. You don't feel the faulty wiring offered a more local, opportunistic sort of criminal a chance?" he inquired gently. "I will not have the council's prudent financial management blamed for the actions of felons." Nettleship snapped, his face flushing. "We have more pressing needs than rewiring a public square for one afternoon a year. This is a matter for the police, Inspector. Find the mask, find the thief, and make a very public example of them." That is all. It was clear that for the mayor the interview was over. Purbright and Love left the oppressive silence of the town hall and walked the short distance to the crooked Georgian terrace where Alistair Finch lived. "Well, that was a help," Love said dryly. "Find the gang of master criminals who were thwarted by my refusal to pay an electrician." "The mayor sees the world as a reflection of his own office, Sergeant," Purbright commented. "It's a common complaint. He's the victim, so the crime must be an epic tragedy. The thief must be a worthy adversary." Mr. Finch's house was the antithesis of the mayor's parlour. Where the parlour was spacious and bare, the historian's study was a cramped warren of paper. Books were piled on the floor, maps curled in dusty stacks, and every surface was littered with correspondence pamphlets and pottery shards in labelled bags. The air smelled of old paper and furniture polish. Alistair Finch sat in a winged armchair, a cup of untouched tea cooling at his elbow. He looked smaller here, diminished by his own clutter. His professional grief, however, was immense. "It's the sheer vandalism of it, Inspector," he said, his voice hushed. "The barbarism. That mask survived the Reform Act riots of 1832. It survived a fire at the old Corn Exchange in 1904. It even survived being used in a student play in the 70s, which I still believe was a profound error of judgment. And now, gone, snatched. You were the last person to see it before the lights failed, Mr. Finch?" Purbright asked, navigating a perilous stack of local history journals to take a seat. "I was. I had just given the cushion a final adjustment. The angle was slightly off, you see. It has to catch the light from the left to properly display the patina of the velvet." He closed his eyes briefly, as if recalling a sacred image. Everything was perfectly in order. Then the darkness and the void. "Did you notice anyone near the dais just before the blackout?" "Anyone showing an undue interest?" Finch shook his head miserably. "Everyone's interest is undue, Inspector." They gawped. They don't appreciate the history. There was the usual collection. Mrs. Trimble from the Guild, trying to see if our bunting was better than hers. Horace Grindle was lurking at the back, scowling as usual. The mayor, of course, preening. At that moment, a woman entered the room. She was considerably younger than Finch, with dark, dramatic eyes and a way of moving that suggested she was perpetually on a stage. This was Lydia Finch. "Alistair, darling, you must drink your tea," she said, her voice a low, theatrical murmur. She acknowledged the police officers with a slight, graceful inclination of her head. "A dreadful business, Inspector." "Simply dreadful. Alistair hasn't been himself." "My wife does not quite grasp the historical gravity of the loss," Finch said with a hint of marital friction. "Oh." "I do," Lydia countered, a faint, ironic smile playing on her lips. "It was the only interesting thing that's happened in Flaxborough all year." She glanced at her husband's stricken face and softened her tone. "I am only trying to look on the bright side, dear." She drifted out of the room again, leaving a faint trail of lavender-scented perfume in the dusty air. Purbright's expression did not change. "Mr. Finch, after you returned the key to the mayor, did you go near the case again?" "Only to supervise. Keep the public at a respectable distance. It is my duty, you see. My responsibility." His face crumpled. "And I have failed." The historian looked so genuinely wretched that Sergeant Love found himself feeling a pang of sympathy. "We'll do our best to get it back, sir," he said. With an uncharacteristic burst of reassurance, Alistair Finch looked up at them, his eyes filled with a scholar's despair. "You don't understand," he whispered. "It's not a thing that can just be got back. It has been violated. The chain of custody has been broken. Even if you find it, it will never be the same." Leaving the scent of lavender and decaying paper behind them, Purbright and Sergeant Love stepped back out into the late afternoon air. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the square. The ropes and stakes of the police cordon looked faintly absurd in the gentle light, a piece of high drama that had overstayed its welcome. "Well, sir," Love said, consulting his empty notebook with a sigh, "we've got a very angry mayor, a very sad historian, and a missing mask. Not what you'd call a wealth of evidence. "We have a wealth of feeling, Sergeant," Purbright corrected mildly, "which is often more useful. It tells us why the mask mattered, if not where it went." While Purbright seemed content to ruminate, Love was a man who required tangible facts. Procedure was the bedrock of his professional existence. He left the inspector to his thoughts and returned to the dais for one final methodical search before the light failed completely. He was not hopeful. The area had been trampled by councillors and gawkers long before the cordon had been established. He started with the dais itself, then worked his way outwards in a slow spiral. He examined the turf, flattened and bruised by the day's activities. It was by the municipal azalea bush, a plant whose anemic blossoms spoke of a deep-seated unhappiness, that he found it. The ground here was soft, having received an over-enthusiastic watering that morning. Pressed deep into the damp earth was a single, clear footprint. It was not the mark of a smart town shoe, nor the faint impression of a lady's heel. It was the deep, aggressive tread of a heavy-soled work boot. Love knelt, his knees cracking in protest, and peered closer. The pattern was distinctive, a lattice of thick ridges surrounding a circular maker's mark. He knew that pattern. He had a pair of the same boots at home for gardening. They were called the tradesman's friend, a brand known for its durability and its utter lack of style. And they were sold at only one place in Flaxborough, Grindle's Hardware. Love stood up, a slow smile of professional satisfaction spreading across his face. The vague, frustrating cloud of feelings and motives was beginning to dissipate, replaced by the beautiful, solid certainty of a clue. He sought out Purbright, who was observing the town hall clock as if it held the secret to the crime. An hour later, in his office, the chief constable listened to the report over the telephone. His voice, crackling down the line, was rich with relief. "Grindle?" he boomed. "Of course." Perfect sense. The man's a walking grievance, always writing letters to the Chronicle. "Good work, Sergeant. Tidy. I like a tidy case. Bring him in. We'll have a confession by morning." For the chief constable, and indeed for the mayor when he was informed, the case was as good as closed. Horace Grindle was a known malcontent with a public grudge against the council's expenditure. He had been seen at the back of the crowd. Now, a footprint from his own brand of boot placed him at the scene of the crime. It was a conclusion of immense convenience. 2 constables were dispatched to Grindle's Hardware with instructions to request his assistance with their inquiries. They found him decanting paraffin into a tin, the reek of it clinging to his overalls. The shop was a cathedral of utility, with everything from fork handles to fire guards hanging from the ceiling or stacked in precarious towers. "A word down at the station?" "What about?" Grindle demanded, wiping his oily hands on a rag. His belligerence was not a reaction to the police presence. It was his default state. "Regarding the incident in the square today, Mr. Grindle," the first constable said, with practiced neutrality. Grindle let out a harsh laugh. "What, you think I pinched that ridiculous bit of felt?" "You've got more time on your hands than sense." Nevertheless, he went. He stomped out of his shop, locking the door with a loud, angry clatter, and marched down the street between the 2 officers, announcing to anyone who cared to listen that this was what honest tradesmen could expect in a town run by fools and incompetents. In the interview room at the police station, his indignation did not diminish. He sat under the single bare bulb, his face flushed, his hands planted firmly on his knees. Sergeant Love conducted the questioning, laying out the facts with methodical calm. "Yes, I was there," Grindle snapped. "It's a public square, isn't it?" "Last I checked, I still paid my rates. And yes, I was wearing my work boots. I'd been at work, hadn't I?" "Unlike some. And you stood by the azalea bed?" "I stood where I stood. I don't keep a map of my movements. I was listening to that windbag nettleship drone on and thinking about the invoice the council still hasn't paid me for the town hall guttering." "You expressed a certain sympathy for the thief, Mr. Grindle," At the Chalves Hotel, Love pressed. I said I'd buy him a pint, and I stand by it, Grindle retorted, leaning forward. Taking that mask was the most sensible thing to happen in this town all year. It saved us having to listen to the end of the mayor's speech. But I didn't take it.
I haven't got the time for such tomfoolery. He denied everything with a consistent, unshakable fury.
He was a man fueled by resentment, a fact he made no effort to hide. Purbright, who had been sitting quietly in the corner throughout the interview, finally spoke. Is it a popular brand of boot, Mr. Grindle? He asked, his voice conversational. Grindle turned to him, momentarily surprised. The tradesman's friend? Best boot you can buy. I sell dozens of pairs. Every plumber, farmer, and council workman in a 10-mile radius wears them. He smirked, including half the blokes who water the council's flower beds. The chief constable's tidy conclusion had suddenly developed a few loose threads. But Purbright showed no sign of satisfaction at this. He simply nodded, a placid, unreadable expression on his face, and returned to his quiet observation. Horace Grindle was released the following morning. There was, as Sergeant Love was forced to concede, nothing to hold him on. His alibi was his anger. He had been fulminating so publicly in the Chalves Hotel that half the patrons could vouch for him, and while his bootprint was at the scene, his point that dozens of others wore the same footwear was unassailably true. The chief constable was displeased. A tidy case had become messy, and messy cases produced paperwork and awkward questions from councillors. Inspector Purbright, however, seemed untroubled by this return to uncertainty. He sat in his office, looking out of the window at the familiar red brick of the building opposite. The overnight rain had washed the streets clean, leaving the town looking fresh and innocent, as if it were incapable of harbouring a crime more serious than an overdue library book. The trouble with a convenient conclusion, Sergeant, he remarked, turning from the window, is that it discourages further thought. Now that Mr. Grindle has proven inconvenient, we are free to think again. Think about what, sir? Love asked, his pencil hovering over a list of names of known associates of Grindle, a list he was compiling with little enthusiasm. We're back where we started. Not entirely, Purbright said. We have eliminated a theory which is a form of progress. I think a return to the physical evidence is in order. Have the display case and the cushion brought over from the station to the town hall. I should like to see them again, away from the scene. An hour later, they stood in the hushed and empty council chamber, the tall, arched windows throwing lozenges of pale light onto the polished floor. The glass case and the forlorn purple cushion sat on the main committee table like exhibits in a museum of failure. The case itself yielded nothing new. Its lock was intact, its surface wiped clean of any prints, save for those of Mr. Finch and the mayor. It was, as Purbright had suspected, a red herring. The crime had never been about breaking in. It was about the brief, accommodating darkness. He turned his attention to the cushion. It was a simple square of velvet, now looking rather pathetic and purposeless without its precious burden. He picked it up gently. It was surprisingly heavy, filled with sand to give it weight and stability. He held it for a moment, his eyes half closed in thought. Then he brought it closer to his face. Odd, he murmured. Sir?
Love had been staring at the glass case, willing it to confess. There's a scent?
Very faint. Love leaned in, sniffed, and straightened up again, a look of puzzlement on his face.
I don't get anything, sir. Smells a bit dusty. No, Purbright said, his voice quiet but certain. It's not dust.
It's lavender.
Lavender water. He recalled the brief, theatrical appearance of Lydia Finch in her husband's study, the trail of perfume she had left in the musty air.
It was the same scent. A scent one did not associate with an oily hardware merchant or a political agitator. It was the scent of a lady's dressing table. He placed the cushion back on the table and began to examine its surface with a new, more focused intensity. His gaze travelled slowly over the compressed nap of the velvet where the mask had rested. Then he stopped. He pointed with the tip of his finger. And what do you make of that, Sergeant?
Love bent down again, squinting.
At first he saw nothing. Then, as he angled his head to the light, he saw it. A single, tiny thread of the velvet pile had been pulled upwards, creating a minute, almost invisible loop. It wasn't a tear or a rip from a rough snatching. It was a delicate little snag, the kind a frayed fingernail or a sharp point of metal might make. It was as if the mask had not been grabbed, but rather hooked and lifted.
Lifted by something small and fine, a splinter perhaps?
Love suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. Perhaps, Purbright agreed placidly. Or the claw setting of a ring, Sergeant.
Or the pin of a brooch.
Something a lady might wear. He looked from the delicate snag to the empty space where the mask had been, his mind connecting the two trivial, misplaced details, the scent of a boudoir and the touch of something fine and feminine. They meant nothing, of course, not yet. They were merely stray facts, inconsistencies in a story that everyone else had been ready to believe. But for Inspector Purbright, they were the first faint notes of a different tune altogether, and he was beginning to think he knew the composer. The lavender and the snag, two small points of light in a large, dark room. For Sergeant Love, they were annoyances, trivialities that distracted from the solid, if now complicated, fact of the footprint. For Inspector Purbright, they were a signal that the investigation had hitherto been looking at the wrong stage. The theft of the Crimson Mask was not, he suspected, a grubby, one-act play about civic resentment. The evidence suggested a more fragrant, more delicate production altogether. "I believe a further conversation with Mr. Finch is required," Purbright announced the same afternoon. "There are one or two points about the pageant's organisation that require clarification." "You think Finch is holding something back, sir?" Love asked, surprised. "I think Mr. Finch is a man who sees the world through a very particular lens," Purbright replied. "The lens of history. I should like to see what happens if we adjust the focus slightly." They found the Finches in their sitting room. The historian was attempting to catalogue a box of dusty parish records, but his movements were listless, his heart clearly not in it. His wife, Lydia, was arranging flowers in a vase with a flair for the dramatic, turning the simple act into a performance of artistic concentration. She was wearing a dark green dress and a silver ring with a small, sharp-looking stone. Purbright noted she did indeed smell faintly of lavender. "Inspector," Alistair Finch said, looking up with weary eyes, "any news? Or have you come to tell me it has been melted down for its historical value?" The joke, if it was one, died in the air. "Neither, Mr. Finch," Purbright said calmly. "I was simply hoping you could help me build a picture of the hours leading up to the pageant. The setup, the various people coming and going from the dais," Finch sighed. "It was chaos."
As it always is.
The Parks Department delivered the wrong geraniums. The mayor wanted his lectern moved 3 times. And then there was the Trimble woman. The name was spoken with a particular academic venom, Mrs. Millicent Trimble.
Purbright inquired. "The very same," Finch sniffed.
"Chairwoman of the Ladies' Guild. She believes that a pot of tea and a well-organized bake sale are the cornerstones of civilization. She considers my historical work to be decorative. She was there, of course, with her flock, ostensibly to check the placement of the refreshment tent, but actually to pass judgment on my display." "She has an interest in local history?" Finch gave a short, bitter laugh. "She has an interest in being in charge. We have been rivals for the soul of this town's cultural life for a decade. Every year she petitions the council to give the guild's Flaxborough through the ages in crochet display a more prominent position. She sees Founders' Day as my triumph, and it galls her. She made a dozen little comments. Is that glass quite secure, Alistair? That cushion looks a little faded, doesn't it?
Needling me. While her husband was lost in the bitter recitation of his grievances, Lydia had finished with her flowers.
She turned to the inspector, her expression one of wry amusement. My husband believes history is a science, she said. Mrs. Trimble believes it is a social occasion. It makes for very tedious committee meetings. And what do you believe it is, Mrs. Finch? Purbright asked, his tone one of genuine curiosity. She paused, tilting her head.
Oh, I think it's theatre, Inspector.
Story we tell ourselves, and the Founders' Day pageant is a rather dull one. The same script every year.
I must confess, this incident has been a wonderful jolt to the narrative.
It's given the whole town a new role to play. And what role is that? The role of the shocked community, of course, she said, her eyes gleaming. Everyone gets to be a detective, a witness, a victim. It's far more engaging than listening to Mayor Nettleship. Before I married Alistair, I was involved with the Chalmsbury Players, amateur dramatics. We once put on a mystery where the body fell out of the grandfather clock. The audience gasped. It was a marvellous sound. She smiled faintly. I heard a sound just like it in the square yesterday, when everyone saw the empty cushion. She spoke not of a crime, but of a successful theatrical effect. Her detachment was profound. Mr. Finch looked at his wife as if her words pained him, a frivolous commentary on a deep and solemn tragedy. Purbright rose to leave. You have both been most helpful.
These little rivalries and perspectives, they add colour to the picture. Lydia Finch saw them to the door.
As she reached to open it, the stone on her silver ring caught the light from the hall. It was a small, sharp point of brilliance. Purbright's eyes registered it for a fraction of a second before he turned to bid her good day. As they walked back towards the station, Sergeant Love shook his head.
So now we have to wonder if Mrs. Trimble took the mask to spite Finch.
It seems a bit extreme even for the Ladies' Guild. It does, Purbright agreed. But then people's motives are rarely as simple as we'd like.
Some people steal things, Sergeant.
Others steal the show. The investigation, having briefly broadened, now seemed to be in danger of evaporating altogether. Sergeant Love spent a frustrating morning making discreet inquiries into the movements of Mrs. Millicent Trimble on the day of the pageant. He learned that she had been in plain sight for the entire duration, marshalling her ladies at the refreshment tent with the strategic brilliance of a field marshal, a position from which she could have neither caused the blackout nor approached the dais unseen. The theory of sabotage by the Ladies' Guild, which had always seemed fragile, now collapsed into dust. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, sat in his office, reading Alistair Finch's slim volume, A Brief History of Flaxborough's Civic Regalia. He appeared to be in no hurry. He absorbed the details of the mask's provenance with the same placid interest he gave to witness statements. He was on a chapter detailing a lengthy and acrimonious dispute in 1894 concerning the cost of its velvet pouch when a young constable knocked and entered. "A parcel for you, sir," the constable said, placing a small, rectangular package on Purbright's desk. "Just delivered by the postman. It was utterly unremarkable. Wrapped in brown paper, tied with ordinary string, and addressed in neat, anonymous block capitals to the Inspector, Borough Police, Flaxborough. There was no sender's address. The postmark was from Chalmsbury, the neighbouring university town. Sergeant Love, who had just returned from his fruitless inquiries, looked at it with suspicion. "Could be anything, sir." Purbright picked up the parcel. It was not heavy, but it had a certain solid feel to it.
Indeed, Sergeant.
That is its principal attraction. He took a penknife from his drawer and, with a few precise movements, slit the string and folded back the paper. Inside was a cardboard box, the sort a pair of shoes might come in. Purbright lifted the lid. Lying nestled in a bed of tissue paper was the crimson mask of Lancaster. For a moment there was a stunned silence in the office. The young constable's jaw dropped. Sergeant Love let out a low whistle of disbelief. "Well, I'll be," he breathed. "The case is over before it's even properly begun." "Whoever it was must have got cold feet." Purbright did not reply. He reached into the box and carefully lifted the mask out by its silk ribbon ties. He held it up to the light from the window. It was unmistakably the genuine article. The worn, wine-dark velvet was just as he remembered. The town's great historical trauma had been resolved by the Royal Mail. Mayor Nettleship would be ecstatic. Mr. Finch would be beside himself with joy. And yet
something was wrong. "Look," Purbright said.
His voice quiet, he turned the mask so that the light fell fully upon its face. There, precisely in the center of the forehead, was a new addition. A single, multifaceted glass jewel the size of a thumbnail had been sewn onto the velvet. It was a cheap, gaudy thing of piercing blue, the kind of thing one might find on a child's toy crown or in a theatrical costume box. The stitching was large and clumsy, done with thick black thread that stood out starkly against the dark red fabric. The act was so bizarre, so pointless, that it defied immediate comprehension. It was not vandalism in the destructive sense. The mask was fundamentally unharmed, but it had been profoundly, intentionally cheapened.
It had been turned into a joke. Sergeant Love stared at the glittering paste gem, his face a mask of professional confusion.
"What on earth is the point of that?" he asked the room at large. "Why go to all the trouble of stealing it just to stick a bit of glass on it and send it back?" "Perhaps our thief is not a thief at all," Purbright murmured, turning the mask over in his hands to examine the clumsy knots on the inside. "Perhaps they are a critic." The telephone rang. It was the chief constable, inquiring about progress. Purbright calmly explained the morning's development. The chief constable's reaction was a mixture of relief and profound irritation. "Returned? With a what? A jewel? Good heavens, what is wrong with people? It makes Grindle look even less likely."
"He's a vandal, not a milliner. This complicates things, Purbright."
"The mayor will want a head on a platter, not a piece of costume jewellery." Purbright made soothing, non-committal noises and hung up the phone. The return of the mask had not closed the case. It had instead thrown it wide open. The motive was not profit. It was not political protest. It was not personal spite, at least not in any conventional sense. This was an act of calculated irony. It was a gesture designed to be seen and discussed. It was, Purbright thought, remembering his conversation with Lydia Finch, a marvellous jolt to the narrative. The first act had been the disappearance. This was the second, the absurd, theatrical reveal. The crimson mask, now tagged and sealed in an evidence bag, lay on Purbright's desk. Its cheap blue jewel caught the light, winking with a kind of insolent cheerfulness. The initial excitement of its return had curdled into a state of profound official bewilderment. Sergeant Love, a man who liked his evidence to be logical and progressive, was finding the entire situation deeply unsatisfactory. "I've put a call in to the Chalmsbury Constabulary, sir," he said, breaking the silence in the office, "to check the post office near the university, see if anyone remembers a person posting a package this morning. It's a long shot." "It is, Sergeant," Purbright agreed, his gaze distant. He hadn't looked at the mask for some time. He seemed to be studying the patterns of dust motes dancing in a sunbeam that slanted across the room. "And the jewel," Love continued, pressing on with the practicalities. "We could try the haberdashers, the craft shops, but it's a common sort of thing. It could have come from anywhere." "I suspect anywhere is not quite right," Purbright murmured. "I think it came from somewhere quite specific. Not a place, necessarily."
"A state of mind." Love looked at his superior, his expression one of polite but strained patience.
He was a policeman. He dealt in places and things, not states of mind. Purbright leaned back in his squeaking chair and steepled his fingers beneath his chin. "Consider the sequence of events, Sergeant. A public ceremony presided over by the town's most self-regarding officials. An artifact whose importance is based entirely on a story we all agree to believe. The ceremony is interrupted. The artifact vanishes. The town is thrown into a state of high, enjoyable drama. Theories are formed, accusations are whispered. And then, just as the drama is beginning to fade, the artifact is returned. But it has been changed. It has been made ridiculous. The symbol of civic pride has been turned into a pantomime prop." He paused, letting his words hang in the quiet air.
"This is not the work of a thief. A thief seeks profit."
"There is no profit here. It is not the work of a common vandal."
"A vandal seeks destruction. Nothing has been destroyed."
"It is not even the work of a simple protester like Mr. Grindle." The message is too subtle, too ironic. A protester would have sent the mask back with a note about potholes. So what's left, sir?
A performance, Purbright said simply.
A two-act play, and the perpetrator is the playwright, director, and lead actor, all in one. The only actor who knows it's a play. He fell silent again, his eyes drawn back to the window. He thought about Flaxborough. He thought of the quiet, ordered lives, the carefully maintained routines, the small ambitions that passed for great passions. For many, it was a comfortable existence. But for some, he knew it must feel like a gilded cage, a place of safety and respectability that nonetheless stifled any impulse towards the grand gesture, the dramatic statement. In such a cage, a person with a theatrical soul might feel themselves slowly suffocating. And how might such a person rebel? Not with anger or violence. That would be too crude, too messy. They would rebel with artifice, with a gesture that was, at its heart, an artistic creation. They would not smash the cage. They would redecorate it. They would take the town's most solemn symbol and give it a wink. See, the gesture said, it's all just a performance.
And I can write a much better one than yours. The motive, Purbright reflected, was vanity.
But not the mayor's simple public vanity, which was satisfied by speeches and applause. This was a more complex, more private vanity. The vanity of the overlooked artist. The desire not just to be seen, but to be the secret manipulator of the scene, to sit back and watch the rest of the cast play the parts you had written for them, unknowing. It was an act of immense, if subtle, arrogance. He thought of the people involved. Alistair Finch, whose passion was real but entirely backward-looking. Mrs. Trimble, whose ambition was for control, not creativity. And Lydia Finch, who had looked upon the crime not with horror, but with the detached appreciation of a fellow performer admiring a bold piece of stagecraft. The woman who spoke of the gasp from the crowd as a marvellous sound. "Sergeant," Purbright said, his voice bringing love out of his own frustrated reverie, "let us for a moment forget the haberdashers in Flaxborough. Sir, I should like you to compile a list for me, a list of all the shops in Chalmsbury that specialise in theatrical supplies. Costumes, props, stage makeup."
That sort of thing, Love blinked. Theatrical supplies, sir?
"What's the connection?" "Our perpetrator has given the Crimson Mask a costume," Purbright said, his eyes finally settling on the absurd jewel in the evidence bag. "It seems only polite to inquire where one might procure such an item." Sergeant Love's inquiries in Chalmsbury proved, for once, to be refreshingly straightforward. There were only 2 establishments in the town that dealt in theatrical supplies. The first was a large professional outfitter that catered to the university's drama department and dealt primarily in lighting rigs and stage makeup. The second, tucked away down a narrow side street, was a small, cluttered shop called the Thespian's Trunk. It was, Love learned from a brief telephone conversation with its effusive owner, a beloved haunt of amateur dramatic societies, school play directors, and anyone in need of historical costume patterns, fake daggers, or, as it happened, cards of assorted glass jewels for sewing onto costumes. They sold, the owner confirmed, a great many of the piercing blue ones. Purbright received this information with a quiet nod. The final piece of the background was now in place. A direct accusation, however, was not his style. It was a messy, unpredictable business that often produced more indignant denial than truth. He preferred to arrange the circumstances so that the truth, feeling itself cornered, would have no choice but to reveal itself. That afternoon, 4 formal invitations were sent out from the borough police station. They were addressed to Mayor Nettleship, Mrs. Millicent Trimble, Mr. Alistair Finch, and, as a courtesy to her husband, Mrs. Lydia Finch. The note requested their presence at the town hall the following morning for a brief, informal meeting to assist Inspector Purbright in a review of security protocols for the town's civic treasures. It was an invitation that no public-spirited citizen, particularly one whose civic spirit was a matter of personal pride, could possibly refuse. They gathered the next day in the same council chamber where Purbright had first noticed the scent of lavender. A pot of weak coffee and a plate of dry biscuits had been provided by the town clerk, lending the occasion a dreary administrative legitimacy. Mayor Nettleship sat at the head of the table, radiating impatience. Mrs. Trimble sat ramrod straight, her handbag placed squarely in front of her like a defensive barricade. Alistair Finch looked mournful, as if attending a post-mortem, while his wife Lydia seemed to observe the proceedings with a detached, almost theatrical curiosity. Purbright began by thanking them for their time. "As you know," he said, his voice calm and even, "the Crimson Mask has been returned. However, the incident has highlighted certain vulnerabilities in our procedures. I would be grateful for your thoughts on how we might prevent any such
embarrassment in the future." The mayor cleared his throat loudly.
The answer is obvious, Inspector. Modernization, a proper alarm system. Perhaps even one of those laser beam devices one sees in films. We cannot allow Flaxborough to be seen as a soft target. A simple padlock might have been a start, Mrs. Trimble interjected, her sharp gaze flicking towards Alistair Finch. "And ensuring the town's electricity supply is fit for purpose." Finch flinched. The glass case was of museum quality, Millicent. It was intended as a deterrent to the casual opportunist, not a concerted attack. The conversation continued in this vein for some minutes, a predictable circling of familiar grievances and self-justifications. Purbright listened patiently, allowing them to play their established roles. He poured coffee, offered the plate of biscuits, and guided the discussion with gentle, non-committal questions. He was waiting for the right moment, the quiet lull that follows a flurry of opinion. When it came, he set his coffee cup down with a soft click that drew their attention. "These are all excellent points," he said, "and I will include them in my report. Of course, my own investigation into the original incident is still proceeding."
"One must tie up the loose ends," he paused, allowing the weight of his next words to settle in the quiet room.
"It is often the smallest details that prove most useful. For instance, we have been able to
trace the provenance of the paste jewel that was
affixed to the mask." He saw a flicker of interest in the
mayor's eyes. Mrs. Trimble looked at him expectantly. "It seems it is."
"Quite a specific type," Purbright continued, his tone as mild as if he were discussing the weather. "It comes from a little shop in Chalmsbury, a place called the Thespian's Trunk. The owner tells me it's very popular with the local amateur dramatic societies." He did not look directly at anyone as he spoke. He appeared to be studying the grain of the polished mahogany table, but in his peripheral vision he observed them all. He saw the mayor's blank incomprehension. He saw Mrs. Trimble's brow furrow slightly, trying to compute this irrelevant piece of information. He saw Alistair Finch's pained confusion. The conversation had strayed from history into haberdashery, and he saw Lydia Finch. For the briefest fraction of a second, her performance of amused detachment faltered. It was barely perceptible. A sudden stillness in her hands, which had been gracefully tracing the rim of her coffee cup, a slight widening of her dark, dramatic eyes. Her lips, which had been curved in a faint smile, settled into a perfectly neutral line. It was the involuntary freezing of an actor who has just forgotten their next line. She recovered almost instantly, picking up her cup and taking a slow, deliberate sip. But Purbright had seen it. It was the tiny, telltale ripple on the surface of the pond. He rose to his feet. "Well, I believe that is all."
"You have given me a great deal to consider."
"Thank you for your time." The meeting was over. They left in a cloud of polite murmurs and scraped chairs, each no doubt wondering why they had been summoned to listen to such a peculiar and inconclusive ramble. Purbright remained standing by the table, the ghost of a thoughtful, satisfied smile on his face. The bait had been laid. Now all he had to do was wait as the meeting broke up and the mayor began to pontificate to Mrs. Trimble about the necessity of a formal security subcommittee. Purbright stepped forward. "Mr. Finch, Mrs. Finch," he said, his voice just loud enough to cut through the mayor's drone. If I might trouble you for just another moment, there is one final point of clarification. The Mayor and Mrs. Trimble, sensing that the main performance was over, took their leave. The heavy door of the council chamber swung shut, leaving the Finches alone with the two police officers. The air in the room, which had been thick with public pronouncements, suddenly became thin and private. Sergeant Love stood by the door, his notebook held ready but unobtrusively at his side. Alistair Finch looked at the inspector with a mixture of confusion and scholarly fatigue. Lydia, however, stood perfectly still, her face a pale, composed mask, her eyes fixed on Purbright. She knew this was no longer a meeting about security protocols. Purbright did not return to his seat. He remained standing, a placid and unassuming figure in the grand, intimidating room. "This will not take long," he began, as if apologizing for the imposition. "It is just that in an investigation one is often left with a collection of small, disconnected facts. And it is only when one finds a thread that ties them all together that the picture becomes clear." He looked at Lydia, his gaze polite but direct. The first fact was a scent, a faint but distinct scent of lavender water on the velvet cushion. "The very same perfume you wear, Mrs. Finch?" Alistair Finch made a small, confused noise, but Purbright continued without pause. The second fact was a tiny snag in the velvet itself. Not a tear, as a rough hand might make, but a delicate pull. The sort of damage that might be caused by the sharp setting of a lady's ring. "Very much like the one you are wearing now, Mrs. Finch, which I noticed when you saw us to the door the other day." He let the two facts settle. Lydia's composure did not waver, but a certain watchfulness had entered her eyes. "These were trivialities, of course," Purbright went on. "They meant little on their own, but they led me to think about the nature of the crime itself. It was not a crime of greed or anger.
As you yourself so astutely pointed out, it was a piece of theatre.
A jolt to a dull narrative. It was an act designed by someone who understands drama, who appreciates the power of a grand public gesture. Someone perhaps with a background in amateur dramatics." He saw Alistair Finch's gaze dart towards his wife.
A dawning horror in his eyes. And finally,
"The jewel," Purbright said, his voice dropping slightly. "The clumsy, theatrical jewel. We found, as I mentioned, that it came from a shop in Chalmsbury called the Thespian's Trunk. A shop you must have known well, Mrs. Finch, from your time with the Chalmsbury players. A shop, I imagine, your husband has never had any cause to visit." He stopped. The case was complete. He had presented it not as an accusation, but as a finished narrative, and he waited. The silence was broken by Lydia. She let out a long, slow sigh. It was not a sigh of defeat, but of release, as if a great weight had been lifted. The mask of composure fell away, replaced by an expression of weary, defiant pride. "It was so dreadfully dull, Inspector," she said, her voice a low, confessional murmur. "The whole town, the whole ceremony. My husband, bless him, sees glory in this dusty little relic. Mayor Nettleship sees a reflection of his own importance. All I saw was a shabby piece of velvet and an opportunity. An opportunity for a little art, a little magic.
I wanted to see what would happen.
I wanted to give them all a better story. So in the darkness I lifted it from its cushion and I walked away." Alistair Finch made a choked sound and sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. "The jewel?" Purbright asked softly. Lydia smiled, a faint, sad smile. "My little flourish. My signature on the work? I wanted to mock their solemnity, to show them it was all just a game." "I see," Purbright said. Sergeant Love finally opened his notebook. The confession was clear. It was time for procedure. "Wait." The voice was a strangled whisper. It was Alistair Finch. He raised his head, his face pale and blotchy, his eyes filled with a desperate misery.
"No, she is
not telling the entire truth." Lydia looked at her husband, her expression softening with something like pity.
"Alistair, don't!" "I must," he insisted, his voice gaining a sliver of strength.
He turned to Purbright. She took it, yes, just as she said. She told me that night.
I was horrified.
Not at the history, not at the crime, but at the thought of the scandal.
Lydia, my wife.
Branded a thief, the disgrace of it. He took a shuddering breath. It was my idea to send it back.
I insisted upon it.
But I knew that if it simply reappeared, you would suspect us. You would find a way to trace it back to us. I lay awake all night trying to think, and I remembered what she had said about theatre, about gestures.
And I thought, if I could make it look like a prank.
Stupid, childish prank. Then perhaps you would not take it so seriously. Perhaps you would dismiss it as the work of students or hooligans. He looked Purbright in the eye, the confession pouring out of him now. I drove to Chelmsbury the next morning.
I had no idea where to go.
I looked for a shop that sold
silly things.
I found that place, the Thespian's Trunk. I went inside.
I felt like a fool.
I bought the first glittering thing I saw. I brought it home. My wife, she thought it was a brilliant piece of irony. But it wasn't. It was the terrified act of a coward. His voice broke.
I sewed it on myself.
With my wife's sewing kit. I made a dreadful mess of it.
I posted the parcel.
It was my vulgar, clumsy attempt to protect her. My pathetic little performance. The two confessions hung in the air, intertwined and separate. Hers an act of defiant artistry, his an act of panicked, protective love. The full, sad, ridiculous truth of the Crimson Mask was finally out. Purbright looked from the wife, who had wanted to steal the show, to the husband, who had only wanted to save it, and felt a familiar, weary sympathy for the strange and tangled knots that people tied for themselves. There was no talk of arrests. In the quiet, deflated atmosphere of the council chamber, the idea of handcuffing the town historian and his wife seemed not only excessive, but faintly ridiculous. Sergeant Love, who had been poised to begin the formal caution, quietly closed his notebook. The matter had moved beyond the simple realm of crime and punishment and into the far more complex territory of municipal face-saving. Inspector Purbright saw to the arrangements with his customary lack of fuss. A discreet telephone call was made to the chief constable, who, upon hearing the full, bizarre story, expressed a profound weariness and an immediate desire for the entire affair to be concluded with minimal paperwork. A subsequent conversation with Mayor Nettleship was even more fruitful. The mayor, when presented with the prospect of a public trial in which the Founders' Day pageant would be described as dreadfully dull and the town's most prized relic as a shabby piece of velvet, turned a shade of pale grey. The idea of the Flaxborough Chronicle printing the full details of the Finches' motives was a horror beyond contemplation, and so a narrative was constructed. The official story, released in a short, dry statement from the mayor's office, was that the unfortunate incident had been the result of a profoundly misguided prank. The Crimson Mask had been recovered, unharmed, and the individuals responsible had expressed their deepest remorse. In the interests of civic harmony, the matter was now considered closed. Flaxborough, for the most part, accepted this. The town had had its little flurry of excitement and was now content to return to its routines. The Finches, however, found that their own routine had been irrevocably altered. They were not charged, but they were judged.
A chill descended upon them from the direction of the town hall and the ladies' guild. Invitations to sherry mornings ceased to arrive. Mrs. Trimble,
when passing Lydia in the street, would inspect the contents of a shop window with an intensity that suggested she had never seen a teapot before. The Finches were quietly, efficiently, and politely ostracized by the very society they had, in their different ways, sought to influence, yet a different kind of fame attached itself to them. In the public bar of the Choves Hotel, the story of the academic and his theatrical wife took on the luster of a minor legend. And among the more artistic students who sometimes came over from Chelmsbury, Lydia Finch became a quiet hero, a suburban surrealist who had dared to hold a mirror up to the town's pomposity. They would sometimes see her in the market, holding her head high, and wonder if she was planning a sequel. Horace Grindle, of course, was insufferable. He had been vindicated, and he made sure everyone knew it. He held forth in his hardware shop on the incompetence of the police, the vanity of the council, and the fundamental soundness of his own judgment, a monologue that was interrupted only by the ringing of his cash register. In his office, Inspector Purbright typed the last line of his final report. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic prose, recording the facts of the theft and the recovery of the artifact while omitting any mention of lavender, amateur dramatics, or marital cowardice. It was a document designed to be filed and forgotten. The crimson mask, its gaudy blue jewel carefully unpicked by a grateful Mr. Finch, was back in its glass case, now secured with a large and very obvious new padlock. Sergeant Love stood by the window, looking down at the street. "Well, sir," he said, with the heartfelt sigh of a man who has returned to solid ground after a long and confusing sea voyage.
I'm glad that's over.
For a while there, it didn't make a lick of sense. And now it does? Purbright asked, pulling the finished report from the typewriter. Well, no, not really, Love admitted. But at least it's finished. Purbright placed the report into a folder and tied the ribbon. The case of the Crimson Mask was closed. Outside, the town hall clock struck 5. The shopkeepers of Flaxborough were beginning to lock their doors. The life of the town, having been briefly and strangely interrupted, resumed its placid, unchanging, and entirely predictable course. The end.